Hello, everybody. How y'all doing today?
Good.
Give us a second. Actually, it looks like the same person's joining on multiples of times. You are in the room twice. You might consider dropping one of them because you might get some echoes. Excuse me. Holy cow. Ugh. Still people showing up. Holy moly. It started when they start to settle down in the drop-in room or the whatchamacallit, the waiting room. All right, it looks like things have sort of settled in for now. So we can go ahead and get started. Boom. Let me get the slides up here. Okay, y'all can see the slides now? Oops. Helps to actually have all the windows open as well. Can y'all see the slides? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. All right. Groovy. Okay, so today we are here for app prep session on creating your school list. So creating a school list it's not a complicated process, but it's not simple at the same time. So I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about it. And so the first thing I want to do when dealing with creating school lists is let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. So this is a lot of times the sentiment I hear. Like, how many people have said this themselves when trying to think about, what school should I apply to? Like, how am I going to get into med school? Have you thought about this? Like, I just want to get into a school.
Yes, so true.
Now, be careful of that sentiment because let's say you get into a school, but it's a terrible fit for you. Are you going to enjoy your, 4 years in that institution and then you're going to get as much out of it if it's a place that's just like an awful school, an awful experience?
No way.
Consider in this process, it's not just enough to get into a school. I want to get into a school that's going to fit. I want to get into a place where they like me, I like them. I'm going to get the most out of this situation. They're going to get the most out of me because honestly, it goes both ways, to be fair. Because as much as you want to just get into a med school, the med schools are also, we just want to get good candidates. And they don't honestly care where they come from with minor exceptions. We'll talk about what those or rules are about. But a lot of it has to do with preference, your preferences for what the school is like, the school's preference for what they're expecting, and all of that. So one of the things I see a lot of schools talking about, or not of schools, but students talking about, is this concept. Um, and I actually had somebody come to me this morning with the words coming in on their lips of like, I've got reach schools and I've got safety schools and all this kind of fun stuff. Honestly, there's really no such thing as reach and safety and all that. And you just got to be careful in putting yourself into that mindset. If you want to get into a school, then you prepare yourself to get into a specific school. You make your application play the role of getting into that particular school. So it's not a case of like, you know, I can't get into this school because somebody on the internet told me so. It's I'm probably not going to get into a school because I don't think I can get into a school. Now, okay, that's within reason. There are some schools out there. Like, can you think of some schools which are truly by the definition of the way they do things, reach schools? Times what you did as an undergrad, you're probably going to have a hard time getting into them. No. For a second, it took me a second to figure out what JHU stood for. Yeah, Johns Hopkins. Okay, that's a good example of something like regardless of where you're coming from, Johns Hopkins is a historically very choosy school because they can get rid of it. They got some reputation that they've got going on in their past. So Johns Hopkins is a pretty darn difficult school to get into, no matter who who you are, where you're coming from, and what experience you have. Like, what other schools are like that? That are just like those really, really got some history to them kind of schools. Let's see if we got the right idea of what those are like. You know, Duke, maybe not so much. I wouldn't put Duke in that list for this reason, because, or for this reason I'm going to tell you right now, for the reason that for people in North Carolina or in the Carolinas, not just North Carolina, but it's a lot easier for those folks because there's a better fit for people at Duke to the people in the Carolinas than for California students. So you also got to remember that there's the regional stuff plays a role in a lot of the decisions that med schools make. Harvard, yeah, I would put Harvard in that kind of that elitist institution that can pretty much choose to do whatever they want. Stanford, no, 100% no. I get a lot of students here in California say, well, Stanford's out of reach. Honestly, I feel like sometimes UCLA is more out of reach than Stanford for a lot of California students, just because of UCLA's like really kind of hoity-toity attitude of what they want to look for. Not even USF or UCSF. I would say the schools that are going to fall in this category are going to be your East Coast Ivies because they're the oldest of the old, and they got this massively long reputation behind them. One people forget about that that's like actually the premier school in the country. It's in St. Louis. Do you guys know which one that is? St. Louis. So be careful of saying Wash U because to a lot of people, Wash U actually refers to University of Washington. But Washington University in St. Louis, also known as WUSTL, WUSTL, Washington University in St. Louis. They actually have right now the highest stats of any of the med schools for acceptance, and which is kind of surprising because it is in St. Louis. But hey, just because you're in St. Louis doesn't mean you're not a premier institution. So a lot of what people put in their minds as like these super prestigious schools may not actually be super prestigious. I think anybody in California, if you're from California, anybody in California has an opportunity to get into a California school. The hardest one in my experience has been for most people is at least for students that have gone to Davis has been UCLA. If you're from SoCal, you improve that situation some. As far as safety schools, I don't think there's any school that's a safety school per se. I think you have to be looking at it as like, am I a good fit for this institution? A good fit is a safety school if you want to think of it that way. Because if I have a good fit for the institution, if I match what they're looking for, I'm probably going to have a higher chance of getting accepted into that institution. So what I'm trying to do here is to basically say all that stuff you see on Reddit about finding yourself, 5 to 10 reach schools and 5 to 10 regular schools, and then like make sure you've got some safety schools on there. Is that really relevant to what I'm going to be talking about here today about trying to create a school list? Absolutely not. with a few exceptions, most schools are not going to be in any kind of reach scenario, and there are no such things as just straight up safety schools, unless you're talking about, I suppose, the Caribbean. And you're going to hear this a lot from all of us. Do we want you applying and getting into a Caribbean school? Is that something we as a HPA would like you all to do? Go to a Caribbean school? Why not? That we don't want you to go to a Caribbean school. What's wrong with Caribbean schools? I mean, technically nothing, but why do we not want you to go there? From too, by the way. That one thing about them is match rates tend to be lower out of those schools. Although they will advertise they have very high match rates, you have to be mindful that the match rates coming out of those are usually higher than might be expected on paper because they process through so many students in a year. They actually run a lot of the schools will actually have 3 classes start in any given year. So that's why they tend to have closer. That's how they sort of match those match rates, if you will. But yeah, their match rates tend to be a little bit lower per student on a per student basis. Expensive. Oh yes, expensive. And there's some other things. There's some other things that go into that too. What happens every fall going through the Caribbean there? 'Med schools that have been just basically shut down for a year or two after students have already started their program. And sometimes those students are kind of out on their own. They have to figure out how to make ends meet, even though school's out of session, and because school's not going to be going sometimes because of massive damage. So Caribbean schools, you can get into them, but in some ways they're safety schools, but in other ways they're actually hard on you. And so be mindful of that as well. There are some other schools that you can get into that are like pseudo international, but they still work with the United States system, like UAG, Oceaner with Tulane, and a couple other programs. So if you want to look into those exist, but I would try to steer clear of the the Caribbean schools if possible, because I think people go to those because they think they're safety schools, but they can get you into trouble. They can get you into some financial trouble. They can get you into some match trouble after all is said and done. And we want you coming out of this with a job, right? So one of the first things people will start to look at when they start looking at what schools are within reach, because there's databases, and this applies to more than just med school. So for any of my dental people out there, my PA people, my all that, like there's lots of different databases out there for all the different programs. I have a list of them later on in the slideshow. So you know for your field, which one you can look at to try to get information about schools in your fields. But they will show you metrics. It's like one of the things that a lot of people get focused on, hyper focused on. First off, averages are not minimums. So let's say I look at Davis. I look at Davis and MSAR, Davis Medical School, and I see that their average MCAT score is 512. Does that mean if I have a 508, I can't get into Davis Medical School? 100% no. I can still get into Davis Medical School without a 512. It's an average. They're going to have some scores that are higher than that. They're going to have some scores that are lower than that. When looking at databases, what I would try to find, and some of the databases have this, some of them do not, but I would try to be looking at the bottom 10th percentile. If you're above the bottom 10th percentile, you will almost certainly get looked at. Your application will get evaluated. And that's what you need, because once your application gets evaluated, what else is important in your application besides the metrics? Or experiences? What else? Application that they're going to be looking at. Statement. I would put numbers under like your experiences that you put in there for sure. Please remember those things that come after you submit your application. Your secondaries are part of that too. But there's so much other stuff. Like, and when all is said and done, all of that other stuff amounts to way more information about you than does just your your metrics. Yeah, like all that other stuff is going to tell us who you are and what you see yourself doing in the future. And that's going to help them make a decision that, like, does this person fit my med school or not, far more effectively than just those numbers. Numbers are, they're threshold. Once you're above the threshold, they're going to look at all this other stuff. Now, another comment I hear from a lot of students is, well, like, what if I have a lower MCAT score and everything else about my application is 100% identical? What are the odds of you having the exact same application as somebody else, except for your MCAT score? Like, zero is as low, very low it is, because like that would be like saying there's another person who's had exactly the same experiences I've had in the same way. They're from the same place. They've had the same personal experiences I've had. Like, there's no chance of that happening. So there's no way your MCAT score or your GPA is going to become that important in your application. Really, just think of it. It's a hurdle. Once you're over the hurdle, that's what you'll be looking at. So the reason I'm talking about this is because don't let this be the thing that drives your school list. I see a lot of people using what's that, Lizzie M score, or people using the MSC scores from Med School Coach or whatever. You know what both of those scores are based a lot upon? Guess what? MCAT and GPA. So those scores don't really mean a lot. They don't carry a lot of weight. There's so much more that you should be looking at. And that's why I like how somebody said it. You as a person in your vision. So when you start looking, what are some of the things you want to do? Well, you want to try to align yourself with what the med schools are looking for. That doesn't mean get certain experiences. I mean, to some extent, yes. Like, if there's a school that requires a certain type of experience or a certain number of hours or something, you do need to provide it. For example, the PA folks, you all need to be getting at least 1,000 hours for many of the schools of healthcare patient care experience. But some of the schools you'd apply to, they don't require 1,000 hours. So if you don't have 1,000 hours, there are still PA schools that will go with, like, say, 500. So you just got to look at what their expectations are. So yes, that's partly what it is, making sure your experiences align with what they offer, but also making sure that your ideals, your vision of yourself matches with the school themselves. Especially lately in this current like time right now, I know we're all in a very sort of funny time of the world right now where things are kind of strange and we have to be very careful and sometimes of what we say about certain things about ourselves and all that. Some schools don't care so much about those things. Other schools do care some about those things, if you know what I'm talking about. So you want to understand what those types of things are for different schools. So you want to be paying attention to not just what the school offers, but what the school life offers you. Well, so first thing I would do is like figure out who you are as a person, because that's a big deal. Who you are as a person is going to help you figure out what the match is. And what is it that allows you to figure out who you are as a person? Like what would you be doing to do that? How do you figure out who you are as a person? Experiences, period, fall into that category. Your hobbies tell us who you are as a person. You'll learn about yourself because you're doing these things. So that's why we want you to get these experiences. And your experiences will help you, you know, go into these schools and say, hey, I match what you're looking for. For you dental people, for dental folks, oh, heck yeah, this is important. Because with dental folks, you need to make sure you got some kind of experience that shows your manual dexterity. Or maybe you want to get into surgery. So you're going to have to show some things to the med schools that I've got good manual dexterity. So your hobby is often that's where that's coming from. So learning about what you are and your morals and all that also come into this. You know, this could be, do you go to church or not? Are you a devout person, or do you have different belief structures? Because that can affect how you interact with the school. So start looking at who you are. And one of the ways to do that, one of the things I would encourage everybody to do if they haven't already started doing this, is to create a journal. So when you're writing up your experiences, or when you're doing your experiences, write them up right away. Don't wait until you're filling out your application to try to come up with what you're going to say about your experiences. You want to do those like right away, because the sooner you do it, number one, the easier it is to remember it. And you can use all that writing when it comes to filling out your application. But it's going to help you figure out and how you're exploring yourself, how you're finding all these things out about yourself. Another thing that I think is important to look at is to learn about what the school is offering back to you. And there's several ways to do this. One of those is to look at one of those application services. So I'm going to jump to that real quick. So where do I find information about different application services? I would go to one of these places. If you're going into medicine, you would either be using the MZAR or the Choose DO or Explorer. That's what that's called. To find out about MD schools and to find out about DO schools. Just a short note, by the way, do not consider DO schools as a backup plan to MD schools, by the way. If you have any kind of feeling like that, it'll come across and it might actually make you less of a solid candidate when it comes to the schools that are looking at you. So make sure you're considering DO schools as an independent option from MD schools, regardless of what you think of them as. So, and then for PA school, you got PAEA online. That's just one of them. It's the one that I actually find the most useful, PAEA for PA schools. For dental schools, you got the ADEA Dental School Explorer. For optometry schools, ASCO member schools and colleges. DVM, you've got the VMZAR, which is similar to the MZAR, but except for veterinary schools. And in pharmacy, you got Pharmcast. If I missed your field on here, I'm sure they have a database for your program, because there's a database for everything these days. You just have to look it up and find it. So you go to these places, and this is probably not the only place you're going to find your information. One of the nice things about each of these databases is it'll actually tell you what, not just what they offer, but it'll also give you links to their website. And you can go to their website. You should go to their website and you should go through it and like just read every page on it and find out what you might be missing just from the surface. So get in and dig through that web page. That's a nice thing. And then when you're on those websites, another nice thing is you'll probably see that most of the schools will have webinars about, you know, what that school is all about. I want everybody to do that for all of their schools that they're going to be applying to. Get in there and find out what those programs are that those schools offer, because they're going to try to talk you up. They're trying to sell it to you. So they'll tell you and they'll answer your questions. And that's a good time to get those answered. So go to webinars. Go to lots and lots and lots of webinars. So find out what they have to offer. And then the match is when you're actually doing your application, you're just trying to say, here's how I fit this school. I fit this school in this way because here's my experience. Here's what you're looking for, and boom. So you're looking basically for schools on your school list that you can answer this or do this process very effectively. You need to be able to show the schools that you fit what they offer and you have what they want. Everybody with me so far? Than you might have thought this process to be. And that's where it gets a little dangerous. When you're online, you see like spreadsheets all over the place. This is not necessarily a super spreadsheetable thing. You can't like create a formula. That's why I don't like these things called like the MSC scores or the LISM scores, because it's really difficult to quantify stuff like this. You need to figure out if this is the place that they value. And plus, what you should be trying to do at this point is make them sell this place to you. They're trying to get you to come to their school. So ask them the hard questions. Tell them like, hey, you can even say this. And I say, if you go to the pre-med conference, the pre-health conference, you could probably go up to those tables and literally just say to the folks, hey, why should I want to come to your school? That's a great question to ask schools. Why should I want to come here? Don't do it all on your own. Figure out what you can do to make them tell you what to do. All right. So when doing this, we've sort of talked about some of this here, but take account of your experiences to figure out who you are. Don't leave anything on the table. A lot of times what I'll have students do, I'll ask them, what are your experiences you're going to put in your application? And then I'll hear things like research and patient care experience and shadowing and blah, 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 like just all kinds of different med school requirements. But what I want you all to remember is like med school requirements are not requirements, but med school expectations, experiences are more than just those few things. They are going to be things like your hobbies, the fact that you're a devout person for your religion, you go to church every week, or you help out at the food shelter just because you want to, because it's fun. You meet a lot of cool people. So there's so much more in your experiences. And also, like if you worked at McDonald's or something, that's a great experience because hey, those people, those customers, they absolutely hate you like your patients are going to probably hate you. So that's okay. You learn from that. You learn how to deal with people from that. All right. There's a question in the chat box. What will MD PhD programs at public medical schools look like in the next coming cycle? Will be more competitive.
That app workout machine is hard.
Tiana, you're unmuted and we can hear you. Just FYI.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. Will it become? I didn't know if you were asking a question there for a second. Will it become more competitive due to budget cuts, or will the number of spots be largely unaffected? Oh, that's a very tough question about MD PhD programs. Actually, that's a tough question about like all of this as a whole. because the funding situations in med schools is tied somewhat to federal funding. And as we know right now, federal funding is a bit of a precarious situation. And so it's not just MD PhD programs, although they are probably going to be touched more than other programs for the simple fact that MD PhDs, the PhD part often gets affected because those grants come from NIH or from NSF and things like that, which are right now in danger of becoming unfunded, or some have already become unfunded. So I don't know if that's going to make them more competitive per se. I think that may just mean that some MD PhD programs may not be taking students this year. We don't know yet how that might be, how any of this funding stuff might be affecting applications overall. You know, like, will it cause us issues for acceptances into just med school, period? We don't know if that's going to be a thing. So that's something that we will keep an eye on. I would probably try to keep it in, like, keep that to a dull roar, because I would believe that med schools right now are going to try to keep it pretty much status quo, at least for the number of people they're expecting. The same with dental schools or any of these things, any of these types of programs. They're probably going to just try to maintain where they're at current levels. And the reason why they kind of have to do that is because if they cut back, then they're going to have a harder time. You know, there's going to be a even bigger shortage than there already is of doctors and dentists and optometrists. So I know that's not the most satisfying of answers, but does that kind of address your concern there, Angelina? So, yeah, with the PhD part of MD PhDs or any kind of doctoral program, that is something we have to watch in the coming years, I think. I already know a couple of friends of mine have lost their jobs because of this. Leave no experience unturned. Do everything. Try anything. They all matter. Think about your ultimate goals. What is it you end up wanting to do? Because that's what's going to help you fit your program, honestly, the best, is if your vision aligns with their vision. And I know the temptation, and what a lot of people will tell you to do is look at their mission statement. But how many people have already started looking at mission statements of schools? Multiple mission statements at multiple schools. What have you noticed? Really similar. That is right. The mission statements all pretty much say the same thing. That's why you need to go beyond the mission statement to see what the school's ultimate goals are, because the mission statement is only of limited value. That's why you just need to, yeah, serve underserved populations, serve the local population, et cetera, et cetera. Have a diverse population of people that can do the serving. So you've got to look at just so much more. So that's where this slide comes into play. Like, go through their entire website, their whole freaking website, because there's so much more that you're going to have to look for to distinguish one school from another. This is also where the databases can come in handy. Some of them are more useful than others, but like, to find out, okay, this school prefers to serve, like, say for Davis, for example, Davis Med School. Would you consider Davis, even though they're an urban school, do they want urban people at Davis, or would they prefer people that are suburban and or rural to come to their school? What do you think? Bigger attractor for Davis to students than urban, because Davis is, I mean, even though they're an urban med school, they're like downtown Sac, their service area is more than just Sacramento. There's a huge population that lives not in Sacramento, like up in the mountains and up and down, like Northern California. Well, heck, Northern California, period, is served by Davis, because nothing else really does. And so there's just so much more to it than just where they're located. It's also realizing from a lot of their programming that they help people out in the middle of nowhere. So you got to dig a little bit deeper, and then look at things like follow their social media. So Facebook, Insta, TikTok. Some schools are doing TikTok now, YouTube, Twitter or X. Although I try to avoid Twitter or X like the plague, just because it's like just so frustrating to be on that site anymore. But like follow their socials so you can see what they present out there about themselves. Look them up in the news. Look up what are the news stories about the schools. Like a lot of times, I don't know if you listen to things like Science Friday or the news, like NPR News podcasts or anything like that. But a lot of these, like a lot of the schools you're interested in probably applying to, they'll be like, oh, and blah, blah, blah at such and such a school. And Davis, UC Davis. The California schools come up a lot, surprisingly a lot in the media. So listen and pay attention for those kinds of things as well. Just to really get a good feeling for what's going on at all of these locations, because you want to see if you're a good match. If you can find students or faculty members outside of recruiters, students will probably tend to tell you more of the straight skinny of what's going on at a school, whether like they like it or not. Recruiters will tend to tell you what they want you to hear, because again, their job is to recruit you to go to their school. So webinars that only have presenters at them that are like the people that work at the school, maybe not as informative as if they have, say, some students. So it doesn't hurt to like do some phone calls, hop into campus if they're close by, see what the school is all about. Here's another big thing that comes up because of current situation. Once you start the application cycle, if you get the opportunity to do an in-person or an a on-campus interview, which one should you take? Or sorry, let me restate that. In-person on-campus interview versus a virtual interview, which one should you take?
An on-campus one.
The in-person one, all day long in person. I saw it online on there. That's not going to be nearly as effective as telling you about what the school is like than going there. And I know that going there is expensive. However, you will get to know the school better. They will get to know you better if you actually go to the school itself. So if you've got the choice in person or online, I would definitely do the in person. So you can find out more about it and you make a more informed decision. That's beyond like the actual application process of building schools, but it's important. So these are just some of the things to think about. Student organizations, why does that matter? Yeah. Not just necessarily even what kind of people you're going to be surrounded by. It's just that you're surrounded by people. If you have a school that doesn't have any sort of student life in it whatsoever, or very limited student life, is that going to be a good supportive? You're going to have that good social support that's usually needed to go through an intense program for 4 years? Maybe not. So yeah, that kind of availability of programming, like students orgs, is very important. Like to the point where like recently all of the most of the student organizations at West Point just got like removed. We won't go into the reasons for why, but they just got removed, and that's causing some people to rethink going to West Point, because if there's no more student organizations at West Point, that makes it not super supportive of an environment. So people are maybe making changes on what they're thinking about. So like that's a big one in my opinion. I think that's something that not enough people look at. Support services overall, I think, are important. Just because, like, do they have any tutoring? Do they have any academic assistance if you're struggling with classes or something like that? You want to make sure that you've got those types of resources available to you so you can, make it through the sticky situations. Another thing that also comes up into this is the curriculum model. Pay attention to that. Some schools do like experience right away. You're like in clinical experience right away from day one. Other schools don't do that. PBL is problem-based learning. Traditional is when you're thinking of like didactic learning. So there's all kinds of different ways of doing this. Pay attention to the news surrounding the schools because, maybe the school lost their accreditation. By the way, most schools lose accreditation at some point. So just because the school doesn't have accreditation doesn't mean you should like automatically discount them. Like CHSU didn't have accreditation for a while when they first opened, and now they do, and it's a whole different ballgame. It just takes a couple years to get accreditation. Like Davis, I think, is coming up for accreditation soon. So we'll see how that plays out. So accreditation things aren't necessarily always negative, but sometimes they can be because maybe they had a administrator being naughty or something like that. Pay attention to that kind of stuff too. So that's a big thing. And here's where we can sort of, if I had to narrow it down, the things I would try to focus on the most. And we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about that first one, location, 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 location. Because there's some important things to note about like where in the country you should be applying. But I would focus on, are they urban, rural, suburban, where they're located? Do they have access to the tracks you're interested in? Some schools may not actually have a surgery track. And that may be just because they focus primarily on primary care or other tracks. So you want to make sure that they've got available to you what you want to be doing once you finish there. You got the curriculum model, what type of community service they have available, how big the class is, or like what their current events are in a sense, their pass rates for boards. All kinds of stuff can come into this. And that's why I say there's just so many factors to consider. This isn't really just a spreadsheet thing. You got to really look at what your interests or what your interests are and where they lie. One note about a specific school that's just come up, and I get this question a lot lately. Which school just went completely free for everybody? But
Albert Einstein.
Einstein. And Einstein has basically, it's a lottery at this point. If you want to put Einstein on your list, I think that's fine. I would consider Einstein, though, as a lottery pick because basically everybody's putting Einstein on their list. I mean, wouldn't you if it's a free school forever? So you got to know that they're going to have so many choices that it's going to be just difficult to get into Einstein overall. That's what we found in this last year. Einstein kind of got really picky because they can now. So questions so far of just sort of soft things to be looking for. Okay. So now the bigger question that I get a lot, and this is one of the reasons why I do this session, is because we also need to be thinking about what schools do people from Davis get into? And that has a lot to do with location and in the country and a few other factors. So let's talk about those things. Now, for DO, for basically everything but MD, your map is pretty wide open. I would say you want to steer clear of like public schools outside the state. Or maybe that's the wrong word. You want to be wary of public schools outside the state. Why are public schools outside the state not necessarily the best choices to apply to, regardless of the program?
They prefer students from their own state.
I mean, that's why they exist, is for students for their own states. Like a state school, they have to serve that population of students from their own state so that they can, serve their purpose. I mean, that's the whole point of those schools. So public institutions outside the state of California generally are harder to get into than other types of schools, private schools. For MD, it gets a little more complicated than that. But for DO, dental, optometry, PA schools, etc., California is our first place to go, and then pretty much anywhere else. There's a lot less of that stigma with, or not stigma, but a lot less of that have to get our own students in mentality, regional preference in the other types of, in those smaller programs. For MD schools, there is definitely a pattern to it. And it doesn't hurt if you're not an MD student to pay attention to this pattern either. So there's 3 blobs that I would encourage you to think about your schools in nationally. So the first grouping, your first run, the schools you should be applying to first, or with the highest priority, should be the ones from what state?
California.
California. That's number 1. That's your first round draft pick, is the California schools. Start there. Like, to be honest, UC Davis is accepts mostly UC Davis students. Let's be fair. So if you were going into UC Davis, if you want to get into UC Davis, you're at the right place to do it. The bulk of the people in the UC Davis program are from Davis in some way, shape, or fashion. There are some people from outside of the area, but they probably went to school with it. So, and I know that's why a lot of you came to Davis, right? Is so you get to go to the Davis Medical School. We know that. So now, round 2. Where are we going to go? Do I go to the Pacific Northwest? Are those schools going to take me? Washington, Oregon State. Those good choices. What do you think? The only West Coast you should probably be paying attention to is just California. Because unfortunately, the Pacific Northwest, which is really like Washington, Oregon, Idaho, those schools, along with Alaska and Hawaii, those are kind of off the map for you. And the reason being is Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Alaska, and Hawaii. Between them, they have extremely few numbers of medical schools. And so what they tend to do is they will accept within that little region, that sub-region, and not anywhere else. So it's not impossible to get into those, especially if you have some like personal connection to those states, but it just becomes harder to get into schools in that pseudo region. What's another region like that for you guys that it's just going to be harder to get into, that have regional preferences? Texas. Now, not Texas are as hard as the others. Like Texas Christian, let's be fair, they use AMCAS. They don't use TMD-SAS. So Texas uses TMD-SAS, but Texas Christian does not. University Incarnate Word for DO schools, they use their own system. So they use ACOMAS. So there are a couple schools in Texas which are good options, but for the most part, Texas, unless you again have family there, it's not the best choice, because Texas it's much like a California region in that it's very populous and they got to get their own students into school. So that's why Texas is kind of off the map. And basically two more areas we got to go. What are the other 2 areas of the country where Californians probably should apply last? So I'm going to say basically New England / most of New York. That's out. New England's pretty tough to get into. And then the other part of the East Coast is the Southeast Coast, which is basically your southern schools. Like, with the exception of maybe Tulane, these schools are going to be kind of hard to get into. So what does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the Southwest and the Midwest. And so those are your two other places where you generally want to be looking for schools to pad onto your school list. Now, with you can throw a couple schools from those unusual regions, but be mindful. One of the schools that I get a lot is Emory. People will see on MZAR that they accept greater than 50% out of state, and that they put on their map that California is one of those states. The problem is most of those out of state people come from the South. They don't come from California. So Emory is not actually a good choice, even though it sort of looks like it is. So just got to be mindful that there's these regional preferences. So we got, if I want to get an MD, what do you say I have a good chance to be able to get into OSU from originally? So OSU is in Oklahoma State. Oh, well, West, I usually think of Ohio State as the Ohio State, not OSU. Sorry about that. But Ohio State, if you're from there, you've got an increased chance. If you're from Columbus or even anywhere else in Ohio, it does increase your chances. Also, though, the Midwest as a whole tends to accept more people from out of state because what's happening to the population of the Midwest states right now, or has been for like the last since the 50s? Populations are growing or shrinking mostly. One down, which means they don't have as many of their own people to serve. So Ohio schools, they're definitely a good choice. Ohio State, actually Toledo, people forget Toledo, people forget Wright State. One of the ones in Ohio I would say be mindful of is Case Western. Case Western is extremely difficult to get into. If you have a connection to there, it can be easier, but Case Western as a whole tends to be relatively difficult to get into. And I know it's Cleveland, and it seems counterintuitive, but yeah, that's a pretty solid, difficult school to get into. So, number in California, number one for MD schools anyway. What I usually suggest people do is they fly in pack bursts. So start with your California schools. That's the top of your list. Then I would say out of the Southwest and the Midwest, I would probably make that like your 2 and your 3. So, whoops. So the Southwest being like in here, and there's a brand new school in Nevada, brand new, just opened up. Roseman. Roseman is traditionally thought of as a dental school. They are opening a medical school, MD school, not a DO school, but an MD school in Vegas this coming year. Actually, they just opened. So that's a new school to be paying attention to in Nevada. But like that's usually like 2 or 3 here. That's my second round. And then the Midwest, like this chunk of the country, that's my 2 or 3. Like I would choose one to make my 2, one of those to make my 3. And there's a lot of really good schools in those states that people just don't think about. And I can say, I'm going to bring up my list from Davis. So for medical schools in the past, this is where we see Davis students going mostly. I lost track of Zoom here. Where did Zoom go? Share. So for MD schools, as you can see, University of California, Davis, UC Davis. This is for Davis graduates. Most acceptance is there. North State, Tech, Irvine, San Diego, LA. What do you see about all these schools? They're all where? They're all in California are the California schools. Then what do you start getting into? Then we got Wayne State. That's Michigan. We got Creighton in Nebraska. We got Michigan State, and weirdly enough, Michigan State in Lansing. We got Rush in Illinois, University of Illinois, Loyola Stritch, St. Louis University, not Worcester, St. Louis University, Drexel in Pennsylvania. And so we're starting to see the Midwest part of the country pop out in this map or in this acceptances. Western Michigan, Rosalind Franklin, Medical College of Wisconsin, then USF. USF is tough to get into, but then we start getting an Arizona school, Albany, Michigan, Connecticut. This one's a weird one to me. Quinnipiac, I would not count on this one. This seems a little oddly high to me. It hasn't been this high in the past. It went up. There's been a spike since COVID for this school and Davis students. I'm not sure where that's coming from. So, like, is this a perfect list of schools that you want to be interested in? Probably not, because this changes every year. Every year, this is going to be distributed a little bit different. I mean, come on, there's new med schools every year too. Plus the DO list, you can see it follows somewhat of a similar pattern. Truro, CHSU, Western U, Truro in Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, Iowa, Kansas City in Missouri, Lake Erie in Pennsylvania. Now we see the Pacific Northwest come in because DO schools, they work a little bit differently. MD schools are where the Pacific Northwest is off reach, but we start to be able to start applying into Pacific Northwest schools in the case of the other field. But for the most part, that map holds true. The places where you're going to have your best chances and the places where I would start looking for all these little details first is those big three regions. You see the map again? California, the Southwest, and the Midwest. And sorry, snow is not a good enough reason not to go to a school. So you might actually have to deal with snow. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. All right. So that's the end of the presentation. I'll stick around and answer some questions if you have them. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of a better idea of, like, don't fall into the traps of the reach schools, the safety schools and things like that. Look for schools that fit you. You're going to get into the schools that fit you over the schools just because they're called a reach school or whatever. So I'll open the floor for questions. Let me stop the recording here. Find it there.